In a magically realistic version of Toronto, a young man named Scott Pilgrim must defeat his new girlfriend's 7 evil, in form of her ex-boyfriends. They will stop at nothing to eliminate Scott from her list of prospective boyfriends. Can he do it? In this video, we will recap a 2010s movie, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. The movie is set in a strange world where everything looks like a huge video game controlled by a computer system. It starts in Toronto, Ontario, where Scott Pilgrim is spending time with his friends in a rock band called Sex Bob OMB. One of the band members, Kim Pine, used to date Scott in high school. Another band member, Steven Stills, is the talented one, and young Neil is a friend who hangs out with the band. At that time, Scott is excited to introduce his new girlfriend to his bandmates, Knives Chow. She's a 17-year-old high schooler, 5 years younger than him. As they practice, Knives watches and becomes their biggest fan. After practice, Scott walks home with Knives. After a while, they arrive at Scott's place, but he doesn't invite her in. He says it's a no girls allowed kind of place but asks her if she wants to see the house he grew up in. Knives says yes, and they walk a couple feet across the street and there it is, Scott's old house. After that, Scott comes into his apartment and tells his gay roommate, Wallace Wells, that he is dating a high school girl and tells Wallace not to tell his sister. But, not long after that, Scott's sister, Stacy, calls and yells at him for dating a high school girl. She heard it from Wallace. Later at night, Scott has a dream where he's in the desert all alone when all of a sudden, a girl with hot pink hair roller skates by and tells him that he's just dreaming. Scott wakes up and tells Wallace, who sleeps in the same bed, as well as Wallace's boyfriend. The following day, Scott meets Knives at the library. However, Scott can't concentrate because he can't stop thinking about the girl with the pink hair in his dream. And while they're checking out their books, he spots her delivering a package and skating away. Later, during band practice, Scott is still preoccupied. Steven shares exciting news that they've been invited to compete in a battle of the bands, and their main opponents will be Crash and the Boys. In the evening, they attend a party at Julie Power's house to network and spend time with music industry insiders. Scott finds it uninteresting and decides to go to the bathroom out of boredom. While there, he runs into Como, who's acquainted with everyone and shows Scott a drawing he made of the girl Scott has been thinking about. Como confirms that her name is Ramona Flowers, and that she's supposed to be at the party. Hearing that, Scott searches the whole party, asking about Ramona and trying to find her. Many guests describe her as a challenging and intense person to date. Eventually, Scott locates her and tries to flirt with her, but he fails miserably. He apologizes and decides to leave her alone. After that, Scott approaches Julie and asks for information about Ramona. Julie reveals that she's American and works at Amazon. Steven, who used to date Julie, mentions that Ramona recently broke up with a guy named Gideon in New York. Julie becomes upset that Scott knows about Ramona's past relationship. And then, Scott continues to follow Ramona at the party until she leaves. The next day, Scott goes online and orders something from Amazon so that Ramona will deliver it. He receives an email from a guy named Patel about a duel and a League of Evil Exes, but Scott finds it boring and deletes it. After ordered something, Scott waits by the door for the package he just ordered, but it's Knives who shows up instead of Ramona. Scott spends time with Knives reluctantly, as his thoughts are consumed by Ramona. Scott has another dream where he sees Ramona skating by and follows her to his own door. When he wakes up, he rushes to the front door and opens it before Ramona can ring the bell. Ramona tells him about a door in his subconscious that provides a shortcut in the subspace highway, which is not common in Canada. Scott repeatedly asks her out until she eventually agrees. At that night, Scott and Ramona go on a date outside, even though it's snowing and cold. To get away from the cold, Ramona takes a shortcut door to her apartment. They kiss, but Ramona doesn't want to have sex with Scott that night. Scott ends up staying over at her place. The next day, Scott asks Ramona to come to the Battle of the Bands with him. At the Battle of the Bands, Scott sees Ramona and his other friends. Knives also arrives, making it extremely awkward for Scott as everyone stares at him. It makes he runs away backstage. The first to perform is Crash and the Boys. They play a great set, which freaks out Steven, thinking they can't follow that. And it's their turn to perform. They go up and in the middle of their performance, Matthew Patel crashes into the room and attacks Scott. They get into a big fight and Scott asks him why they are fighting. It turns out that he is one of Ramona's 7 evil ex-lovers. And by the rules of the video game world which they live in, Scott must defeat them all in order to go out with Ramona. Scott manages to defeat him and he bursts into a bunch of coins. Scott and Ramona leave on a bus where she explains that they are now dating, but he must defeat all of her evil ex-lovers. With one down, there are 6 to go. That day, Scott asks his friend Wallace if he can borrow their apartment for a date with Ramona. Wallace agrees, but only if Scott breaks up with his current girlfriend, Knives. Scott is hesitant but ultimately decides to break things off with Knives. During their conversation, Knives confesses her love for Scott, but he still ends the relationship. Meanwhile, Wallace goes to the castle to watch a movie being filmed, while Scott and Ramona go on their date. However, the mood gets awkward when they talk about their pasts. Scott reveals that he had a painful breakup with his ex-girlfriend, Envy Adams, after her band got a big record deal. After that, they visit the castle and learn that Lucas Lee, an action star, is one of Ramona's evil exes. Scott is beaten up by Lucas's stunt doubles, but he fights back and defeats them all. However, Lucas is too strong for him, so Scott tricks him into performing a dangerous stunt, which causes him to explode and be defeated. Scott won this fight, although he is disappointed because he didn't get Lucas's autograph. Not long after that, Ramona leaves during the fight without saying goodbye to him. The next day, Scott tries to call Ramona, but she doesn't pick up. Wallace hopes they'll get together so he can move out without feeling guilty. While walking in an alley, a teenage girl named Roxy Richter attacks Scott. He tells her he's not interested in fighting, and she leaves, warning him she'll come back later. After that, Scott goes to the coffee shop where Stacy works, hoping to talk to her. But he finds Ramona there instead, and they have a conversation about their past and how it shouldn't affect their current relationship. Suddenly, Scott sees Envy standing behind Ramona. Envy's band, Clash at Demon Head, is playing a gig in Toronto that night, and she invites Scott and his friends, including Ramona, to come and listen. At the concert, they discover that Todd, the bassist of the band, is another one of Ramona's ex-boyfriends that Scott must defeat. Meanwhile, Knives is now dating young Neil but becomes jealous when she sees Scott with Ramona. Envy invites them backstage, where Knives acts like a crazy fan and Todd punches her. Scott tries to fight Todd, but Todd has psychic powers and stops him in midair. Todd has psychic powers because he went to a school for vegans. Scott fights Todd, but he realizes he can't win, so he challenges him to a bass guitar duel. But unfortunately, Todd wins and knocks Scott into the next room. But Scott have another idea. He tricks Todd into drink coffee with real milk, causing him to lose his vegan powers. The vegan police show up and punish Todd by disintegrating him into coins. After that, Scott apologizes to Envy and leaves with Ramona. They go to the Clash at Demon Head's after party. Scott is feeling threatened by Ramona's past and her evil exes who keep trying to harm him. Suddenly, Roxy, another one of Ramona's exes, punches Scott in the back of the head. Ramona decides to defend Scott herself and pulls out a giant sledgehammer from her purse. They fight and defeat Roxy. However, Roxy tells Ramona that Scott must fight her in order for it to count. Scott refuses to fight a girl, so Ramona takes control and uses Scott's body to fight Roxy. After the fight, Scott is upset and considering leaving Ramona. She gives him a list of the remaining evil exes he has to defeat and leaves. During a band meeting, Scott and his bandmates discuss their plan to win the next battle of the bands against Katayangai, a pair of twins that Ramona dated before. At the concert, both bands turn into giant electric monsters and have a band battle. Ramona and Gideon Graves watch from the audience. And fortunately, Sex Bobo MB wins, defeating the 5th and 6th evil exes. Scott grabs an extra life, and outside he tries to win Ramona back, but she decides to get back with Gideon. Gideon likes the band and wants to sign them, but Scott refuses. Unexpectedly, the rest of the band agrees to sign with Gideon, and young Neil takes Scott's place on bass. At that time, Scott is feeling down, but Wallace encourages him to take action and fight for Ramona. It makes Scott excited again and goes to a secret nightclub where Gideon and Sex Bobo and B are playing. And then, Scott declares that he loves Ramona and challenges Gideon to a fight for her. With the power of love, he pulls out a flaming sword from his chest and fights Gideon's minions and Gideon himself. Knives appears to help Scott, but then she fights Ramona because she hates her. Scott intervenes and admits to cheating on Knives with Ramona, but he doesn't think he cheated on Ramona with Knives. Unfortunately, Gideon stabs Scott in the back and kills him. Not long after that, Scott woke up and finds himself in the desert, alone and dead. Ramona appears and they talk about what he has learned and who he is really fighting for. Scott uses his extra life, which takes him back to the beginning of the scene. He repeats the fight up until Gideon asks him who he's fighting for. This time, Scott answers himself and it makes him gains the power of self-respect. Scott pulls out another giant sword from his chest and launches himself at Gideon, defeating him. During the fight, Knives shows up and kicks Ramona in the head. Scott stops her and takes responsibility for cheating on both of them. Suddenly, Gideon rises again, but Knives and Scott team up to defeat him, causing him to disappear into 10,000 coins. Before leaving, Nega Scott, an evil version of Scott, shows up. He asks Ramona and Knives to wait outside while he and Scott have a fight. Ramona and Knives stay outside, and after a while, Scott walks out with Nega Scott laughing and having a good time. Scott tells Ramona and Knives that Nega Scott is actually a nice guy and they plan to meet up for brunch next week. Ramona decides to leave, not wanting to make him another evil ex. And Knives tells Scott to go after Ramona, as she is the reason he went through all of this. Scott catches up to Ramona, and they decide to get together. In the final shot, we can see they walk through another subspace door.
What do you think of this movie? Please share your opinion in the comments below. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more recap videos.